In fact, the deaf used signs, but the Indians used gestures, and a more accurate name for the Indian system would be the gesture language. When the white men came into the Great Plains, they borrowed the signs and signals from the Plains Indians to communicate with one another when riding the range or driving their herds up the trail. The cattlemen did not borrow these signs and signals because they could not speak one another's language. Just more proof for his point. Cattlemen were using this sign language. They adopted it from the Indians, not because they couldn't talk to each other, but because the plains are so vast and such distances can separate you from another man with whom you need to communicate. QED right there, huh? Skipping to the next page. Closely related to the sign language was the signal system. Smoke signals were used among all Indians, but as Ironhawk said, this Indian they had talked to, the Plains Indians also used blankets, horses, and mirrors. Interesting. It does not seem necessary to go into the use of smoke and blanket signals and the use of the horse in signaling, except to state that these were used for communicating at greater distance than gestures. So where gesturing fails, then the use of horse and smoke and blanket signals were used. They were in fact extensions of the gesture system, not to be used alongside or instead of, but to be used when the gesture system where the distances were too great. An Indian scout perched on a distant hill could, by maneuvering his horse, give his party information as to the proximity of game, the presence, number, and direction of the enemy, and could indicate what should be done in the emergency. A returning war party could inform the camp of the outcome of their foray, of its success or disaster, and of deaths in the party. The United States Army officers considered an Indian contingent essential in campaigning on the plains. I don't know if there's some exaggeration here, but here's what Colonel Dodge says. In communicating at long distances on the plains, their mode of telegraphing is remarkable. Indian scouts are frequently employed by the United States government and are invaluable, indeed almost indispensable to the success of important expeditions. The leader, or interpreter, is kept with the commander of the expedition, while the scouts disappear far in advance or on the flanks. Occasionally one shows himself, sometimes a mere speck on a distant ridge, and the interpreter will say at once what the scout wishes to communicate. It's not to the exaggeration yet, but here's the exaggerated part. Possibly, I don't know. The only really wonderful thing about the telegraphing is the very great distance at which it can be read by the Indian. I have good plains eyes for seeing on the plains. But while, even with an excellent field glass, with a little telescope, a field glass, he says, even with a field glass, a good one, I could scarcely make out that the distant speck was a horseman, while I could hardly even see it as a horseman. The Indian by my side would tell me that what the distant speck was saying. I just don't know. So he can't hardly even tell that it's a man on a horse with his field glass, but the Indian with the unaided eye could tell what was being said. I don't know. Maybe. Okay. This is the last quote I have from this chapter. On the plains, it was much more essential to communicate with your friends at a distance than with your enemies. You could always fight your enemy, but safety lay in understanding your friend and allies fully. One would not argue that our own signals and telegraph system were devised to communicate with strangers. Alright? So how is it that the Plains Indians supposedly developed sign language to communicate with strangers? So one wouldn't argue that. These were devised, our telegraph and signal system were devised to communicate over distances that could not be negotiated by the human ear and voice. So were signs and signals with the Plains Indians. QED. There we go.